Hi friends, I'm Amy Julia Becker, and this is Love is Stronger Than Fear, a podcast about pursuing hope and healing in the midst of social division. In this season, we're talking about how we can respond to the brokenness that's in our own lives and in our society, how we can respond with our whole selves, head, heart, and hands. Today is our first episode of this new season. I'm so thrilled to get to talk with Jemar Tisby. He's the best-selling author of The Color of Compromise, also the author of the recently released book, How to Fight Racism. And today we get to talk about all sorts of juicy topics: racial identity formation, friendship, reparations, Black Lives Matter. And we're doing all of that under a banner of hope. I'm here today with Jemar Tisby, and it is awesome to see you again. Really awesome that we get to share with our listeners. This is the first episode of a new season, and we get to share about your new book, which is How to Fight Racism. So welcome, and thank you for giving us your time today.
Oh, thank you for giving me the first slot in your new season. That's exciting.
I was excited for how that worked out. As many listeners will remember, you and I talked a couple of months ago about your first book, The Color of Compromise, which came out in 2018. Am I right?
January 2019. So
January 2019. Okay. So, and then kind of skyrocketed to the New York Times bestseller list somewhat unexpectedly, right? A year and a half after it came out. And that is a book that's highly accessible, I will say, but also it's a work of history where you are tracing the American church's history and of complicity in racism. I know a lot of churches that have used that book as a study guide with the videos that you've also published and produced, and that's been really accessible, really helpful. We had a great conversation about that. And again, that is all looking back through hundreds of years of our past here in America, and especially in the what we now would call the kind of white American church. You've now written a book that is almost entirely directed to the current moment, called How to Fight Racism. So I wanted to start there just in asking, how did you go from history to this present moment, moving from one book to the next?
The actual practical aspect of fighting racism has always been my passion. Actually, I thought a book like How to Fight Racism would be the first book I wrote, but it was in conversation with publishers and agents that we kind of landed on the idea, well, before you get to the solutions, you got to talk about the problem first. So that was The Color of Compromise, diagnosing the problem of racism, particularly in the U.S. church, from the viewpoint of history. But I always say, you know, the Color of Compromise is 11 chapters long, and really the first 10 chapters were all a setup just to get you to the last chapter, which was called The Fierce Urgency of Now, that eloquent phrase that Martin Luther King Jr. used in his I Have a Dream speech. And that chapter focuses on the practical aspects, the how-tos, the what-to-dos. And because The Color of Compromise was mostly a historical survey, I only had space in that book for one chapter to talk about these things. But really, what I always wanted to do was talk more in depth and more at length about it. And so How to Fight Racism is almost an expansion of that last chapter in The Color of Compromise. That being said, each book can be read independently of the other, but they fit together nicely in terms of diagnosing the problem and moving towards solutions.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And I agree that they're a wonderful pairing and could be read independently. Although I will say, as someone who, you know, I've taken church history, I've taken African American church history, just over the course of my many years, and I still learned a lot from reading The Color of Compromise, and I know that's been true for a lot of people, and it does explain so much about our present moment if we have done that historical work to say, oh, like that's how we got here. I mean, one of the things you bring up in How to Fight Racism is we wouldn't have a Black church if it weren't for racism. Like what we now call the Black church would not exist if Black people had not been forcibly excluded from the church in America in what it should have been, which was a place where all of God's people could come together to worship. So I do think that just to underscore the significance of what you've done in providing both that historical work and this okay, what does that look like to respond to that in our present reality? And that really is what I want in this season of the podcast to be talking about, is we see all this social division, and we want to, I think right now we are in a moment of awakening across our country. For some people, that is really new. For others, it feels kind of old. One way or another, we are asking the question, how do we respond with hope and healing to the social division that has plagued us for so long? And your book really is a guide into not just that conversation, but into taking action. And you talk about, and you mentioned this at the end of The Color of Compromise too, the arc of racial justice. Could you describe to our listeners what that is and what that means, and even like how you came to frame it in that way?
Yeah. I'm glad you asked about that. For every writer, and especially book authors, the structure is so important, because once you get the structure down, you can start to make progress on actually writing the book. And for the How to Fight Racism book, the structure is actually pretty important. And so it's based on what you just mentioned, the arc of racial justice, which is a model I've been developing, and it's an acronym that stands for awareness, relationships, commitment. And I think you need all three of these elements to have a stable platform on which to build your racial justice efforts. And so the components are somewhat self-explanatory. Awareness is the knowledge, the information, the data that you need to understand race, racism, white supremacy, how it all works. Because if you don't have a proper knowledge base or proper understanding, it's going to be hard to move toward solutions. And so that's reading the books, listening to the podcasts, going to the conferences, whatever it might be, to fill your knowledge and round out your knowledge base. But beyond that, there's the relationships component. And this gets at the idea that all reconciliation is relational, that all racial justice is in some sense relational. And I especially mean when we have to cross different boundaries, race, ethnicity, culture, so that people don't simply become the other or the enemy, but human beings, image bearers of God, and how that affects the way we treat other people, the way we love our neighbors, the way we maneuver in the world. But I recognize that oftentimes we leave it at relationships. And so that's where you get statements like, some of my best friends are Black, or, I'm nice to people who are different. So therefore I'm not racist and I'm not part of the problem. Well, obviously keep those relationships, that's good. Don't want you to be mean to other people or not have diverse relationships. But let's recognize that that's necessary, but not sufficient. And so we have to go a step further to the commitment aspect. And that's really getting at the laws, the policies, the systemic and the institutional factors that create and perpetuate racial inequality. And so, it's great to have that heart-to-heart conversation over a cup of tea or coffee, but ultimately that's not going to do anything about mass incarceration. It's wonderful to have the pulpit swap or the church partnership. That may not do anything about issues of voter suppression, and on we can go. And so the commitment aspect says that our systems are corrupt, our practices are corrupt, and we have to work on a broad scale level to fight racism, not just on the interpersonal level.
Yeah, I agree that the interrelationship between those things is what I think you do at some point call it a holistic response, and really a lifelong journey as well. This is not something that happens in a moment, or that now I've checked these 3 boxes and I'm done, but there is a sense of being committed to, especially in our country, being committed to racial justice is a part of what it means to be committed to the work of justice that God wants to do as a God of justice and of healing, and of love, and all of those attributes. And I do want to ask you specifically about a few aspects of each of those, the awareness, relationships, and commitment. But I also wanted to ask you, because I think you do such a good job, even though you are an academic and you are a scholar, you don't write books as though we're having to wade through professorial, gobbledygook in order to understand. It's no, we just get to understand what you're talking about pretty accessibly. You also, though, as someone who has been on what you call a journey of racial justice, probably for longer than some of your readers, you don't treat people like, oh, come on, you need to sprint to catch up to me here. You really do take people on a journey that's very welcoming. And I'm curious if you could just talk, and you mentioned in the book a little bit, like your own journey of awareness, relationships, and commitment. And so I'd love to just hear your own story a little bit before I dig in and ask you some more specific questions about the book.
Yeah, thank you for that question. A lot of what's in the book is related to my journey. And honestly, this is an intimidating book to write, How to Fight Racism, right? Like you're some expert or whatnot. And I fully recognize that there are activists and legal experts and people who've been doing this work for decades who have really, really good things to say. What I tried to do in How to Fight Racism was be authentic to my experience and my perspective, which is very closely related to my journey. And so some of my earliest memories of race are being on a basketball team in middle school. And I was no good. I was the last one off the bench. I think I got to play in maybe one game or something. But it was about, the camaraderie. It was about hanging out with my friends. And we would go traveling to these other schools. Our school was in a working class town, blue collar. I remember we constantly had to do fundraisers and things like that. Our gym was ancient, and so the floor had divots and chips and pockmarks in it. But it was all we knew. But then when we went traveling and we went to some of these other schools in more affluent districts, I remember walking into a gym that had rubber floors. And I was like, I didn't even know you could do that. I didn't even know they made floors like this. And I remember even as a middle schooler thinking the only difference between our school and this one is that the kids at our school are black and brown and the kids at this school are white. And I didn't know all of the baggage that went with that, but I was like, there's something that's not fair about this. And so that sense of unfairness, and that continued on through junior high and high school, especially where my group was an interracial group of people. My town was 40 to 50% Latino, and then about equal portions black and white. And we also had pretty large East Asian and South Asian populations. And so my group of friends was all different shades and hues. But whenever we would go out in public to the movies, to the arcade, to the mall, we'd get followed by police. And, we're teenagers. We're not doing anything but hanging out, talking about girls, all the things that teenagers do.
Right.
But yet we were under this cloud of suspicion. All of that gets exacerbated when I become a Christian in high school, which is through the ministry of a white evangelical youth group. I hadn't grown up in the church. And so this was sort of my first exposure to Christianity. And it was this strange dichotomy of being welcomed into a group because they were all about evangelism, seeker sensitive, all that kind of a thing. They were really good at bringing people in, but also looking around and noticing, there ain't that many black people here. Matter of fact, sometimes I'm the only one. And that was the same with the church that was attached to the youth group. And I was absorbing all of this theology, all of this preaching, all of these pastors, all of these books who were white, who were evangelical, eventually who were reformed and evangelical. And that was really part of my awakening because unfortunately, the places where I felt most excluded, most ostracized, most sort of hyper visible because of my race has been in the church. And so that's why, it's called Courageous Christianity and the journey toward racial justice. There's an element where I say in the introduction, why Christianity? Because this is a book for anybody. You don't have to be a person who claims a faith tradition to read it and benefit from it. But I did want to include Christians because so often, particularly white Christians, have been part of the problem.
Right.
So you also have to be part of the solution. And so a lot of this is stuff I've learned along the way, trial and many, many errors, but lifelong experience as a Black person in the United States, and then over a decade of experience working in some sort of formal capacity with churches and nonprofits talking about race, racism, and racial justice.
So pretty early on in the awareness section, you write about encouraging people to explore their own racial identity, and white or Black or a person of color, whoever you are, to actually ask some questions and write down or speak out. Like, when was the first time you were aware that you had a racial identity? What were your experiences? I thought your list of questions was excellent, and that's not something I've seen before. I mean, I've read a lot of kind of action steps, which are often very, very helpful. You have action steps as well. But I just thought that including and beginning with that sense, not just of, because you encourage this too, explore the racial history of the institutions that you're a part of, explore the history of your family, there are so many questions we can ask about not only our own lives, but the lives that we're a part of in our families and our churches and our schools and our towns and our nation. But I really thought that the questions you asked and the way you framed that was very gentle and invitational, but also it's a big challenge to actually do that work, to say, what are my parallel memories, right, to your memory in middle school. I remember when I was younger than that, like probably in and I lived in this what I now would call a functionally segregated town in the South. I remember watching a movie where there was a black man in the pews of a church among a predominantly white church, and asking my mother what he was doing there. And my mom was like, what do you mean? What is he doing there? And I was like, I just thought that wasn't allowed. And my mom, of course, is realizing, oh my gosh, I'm raising my daughter to think that black and white people can't go to church together. Because I was like, well, why else would we have two different churches? Like, that doesn't make, because I was so young, but it was so striking to me and it didn't make any sense. Like, why are we not in church together if that's actually allowed? And of course, why did I think it was not allowed? I don't know. But there are those moments, and it's so good to start putting them on paper and saying, oh, how did this shape and form the way I see myself, the way I see other people, the prejudices that I've carried with me, the unwitting or intentional participation, for me as a white person, in systems of injustice. So I loved the way you asked those questions. And I'm curious for you, you've said a little bit about this, but do you feel like you had your own racial identity exploration that you needed to do? And can you also just talk a little bit about that as a concept? Because not everyone's familiar with the idea of racial identity and how understanding it can help us to fight racism.
Definitely. So you're touching on two really important aspects, I think, in terms of practical ways to fight racism. Again, all under the building awareness umbrella. But one is, I don't think we've interrogated our own stories well enough when it comes to race. And this spans the racial spectrum. It's a little different if you're Black or a person of color, but at the same time, all of us, I think, would benefit from a sort of intentional and sustained examination of our path thus far, particularly in when it comes to race. And so, yeah, some of the questions I ask are, what is your earliest memory of race? I also ask, have you had any negative experiences associated with your racial identity or that of someone else? I say, when did one start growing racially conscious, like attaching meaning and importance to these issues? And I do encourage people to actually write it down, because the act of writing it down forces you to choose your words, forces you to sift through your memories, forces you to articulate your experiences in a way that maybe you've never done before. And the act of writing helps you make sense of it too. And so it's hard to figure out where you want to go if you don't know where you've been, and particularly how you've been shaped, racially speaking, in ways that you may not even realize because you never stopped to really think about it, much less put it on paper. So that's one aspect, writing your own racial autobiography.
Yeah.
What you also bring up is the idea of racial identity development. And here I'm borrowing heavily from social psychologists and the therapist community, where it's an actual model, it's a framework, originally developed in the early 70s. It was called the theory of nigrescence. In other words, the process of becoming Black. But since then, it's been expanded upon and expounded upon. So now it's not just a framework for Black people. They have different frameworks for people of color, for biracial people, for white people. And the basic idea is this, that we all start out from a state of sort of passively accepting the status quo. It's exactly what you were talking about when you asked about seeing the Black person in a pew in a predominantly white church.
Yeah.
at that point, you just sort of observed around you and took the status quo as normal, and didn't really question it until you saw something that seemed out of the norm. And we all have that stage in that process, typically at the younger ages. And it doesn't mean we don't notice differences. There's the kindergartner who say, "Oh, you're chocolate, I'm vanilla," whatever it might be, right?
Yeah.
But you don't necessarily attach a meaning or an importance to that until another stage in racial identity development is there's some disruptive experience, often a series of experiences. And these come at different seasons in life. So it was me, going to that gym and seeing how much nicer it was, and the only difference being the student population. But it's also events like the murder of Trayvon Martin in 2012.
Sure.
Many people have called this generation of activists the Trayvon Martin generation because it was such a disruptive event in our lives that it catalyzed us to want to learn more. And then for Black people, part of our racial identity development is a recovering and a reclaiming of Black culture and history. And so there are a lot of Black folks who go through sort of a afros and dashiki kind of phase.
Mhm.
And that's actually a really important part of racial identity development, because what you're doing is reframing what you've learned so that you view your own race, your own culture, your own identity, your own history, your own background in more positive terms in light of a society that has, in ways both overt and covert, tried to teach you that that is somehow lesser and exotic and substandard than the white norm. And so Black people go through this, all people of color go through this, white people go through this too, which is a process of realizing you even have a race.
Right.
Because part of what white supremacy does is say, you don't have a race. You're just, Jane or John or Karen or whoever. And everyone else has a race,
right,
but not you. And so that's part of your racial identity development as well. So I talk a little bit in the book about that.
Yeah, and again, I mean, the questions alone are like worth the price of the book, and that exercise alone, I would say, as far as people developing an awareness of as you said, exploring your own story. I want to pivot for a minute and ask you one question that goes back to what you were saying about the Trayvon Martin generation. And I have noticed, especially, and I'm sure you have too. I know I've heard you talk about this before, but that there are many white Christians in particular who have dismissed the Black Lives Matter movement and other aspects of protests and demonstrations against racism and injustice because they see it as atheist and Marxist. And I guess there are two things I want to ask. So what do you think that Christianity in particular has to offer to this conversation? Because, and as a Christian, why can you participate wholeheartedly in a movement that does have some relationship to what might be called atheist or Marxist, right, ideas? How can you participate in that wholeheartedly? And what does Christianity bring to bear within that? How do our theological commitments actually inform and enliven a conversation even among that movement and within that? Because again, I mean, historically speaking, and in the current moment, we see that there are a lot of Black Christians who are powerfully engaged and involved. And I, for one, do not in any way want to dismiss that. And so I'd love to just hear you wrestle with that a little bit and perhaps add some theological insight to the way this debate gets, thrown around out there.
It's such an important question because the way historians talk about it is this, that there is a 400-year-long plus Black freedom struggle. There are different phases of the Black freedom struggle that can be called by different names. There's the abolitionist movement, there's the civil rights movement, there's the Black Power movement. Now I think we are in the phase of the Black freedom struggle called the Black Lives Matter movement. And for, whatever confluence of events, this was the banner, this is the label that the current wave of the Black freedom struggle is under. And in every wave of the Black freedom struggle, by any name, Christians have had to respond and react and wrestle with whatever banner they were under in that era. And so what we're seeing now, as far as this conversation about Christians and participation with Black Lives Matter, is not dissimilar than what you would have seen when Christians talked about the civil rights movement or Black Power movement. To what extent, how can we be involved? Is it atheistic, or is it compatible or incompatible with Christianity? So I just want to highlight the continuity here in this debate. I also want to highlight the continuity in tactics. And so the folks who are invested in the racist status quo, whether consciously or unconsciously, one of the main tactics they use is labeling people. And over time, the labels have changed. And so you can Google this, but there's a picture of white segregationists protesting integration at some government capital or something. And there's a sign of somebody holding a sign that says, race mixing is communism. Mm-hmm. Race mixing is communism. And communist or Marxist was the label they used in the 50s and 60s to label civil rights activists, whether they were Christian or not. And what labeling does is means I can put you in a box, put you on the shelf, and ignore you, ignore what you're saying.
Yeah, I mean, I want to have you keep going, but I will interject just to say, again, as a child in the 80s growing up in North Carolina, I remember talking about Martin Luther King and having an older white Christian woman say, well, you know, he was a communist. And I was, again, thankfully young enough to just be like, that's confusing. And now, 30 years later, I think most people in America do revere Dr. King and do not think of him as a communist. They think of him as like the I had a dream guy, right? But the fact that even in the 80s, when I was growing up, like he was being called by white Christians a communist as a way to essentially say, I don't need to listen to those ideas, and I don't need to recognize him as a Christian brother. Even if there are things we're going to disagree about, I'm going to be able to put him in a category where we don't have to engage. And again, I didn't understand all of that as a kid, but I remember being like, what? I'm confused here. Yep, so yes, I can just from personal experience and so again, when all of this came up with the Black Lives Matter movement, I remembered that and was like, that's what they were saying about Martin Luther King 30 years ago in my experience, and 40 and 50 years ago too. So just to underscore the point you're making, that this is a tactic which may be unwitting or it might be intentional, but that has been going on for a long time.
Very much so. And the labels change over time. So you still get the Marxist Communist labels being thrown around, but now it's much more frequent that you'll hear one of two things, either critical race theorist or socialist. Mm-hmm. And in the Georgia Senate runoff race, it was a very interesting dynamic because you had the white Republican candidate, Kelly Loeffler, who calls herself Christian, evangelical, I suppose. Okay. And the Black candidate, Raphael Warnock, who occupies the pulpit at Ebenezer Baptist Church, the same church that Martin Luther King Jr. helped lead. And he espouses something we might refer to as Black liberation theology, mm-hmm. and is very much in the Black church tradition of seeing one's role as a minister as compatible with and even part of your call as a minister to get involved politically. Mm-hmm. And because so many political activities have a direct bearing on the safety and quality of life of Black people, people of color, and poor people. And so that you can't be a leader of God's people. You can't preach good news unless you're also attending to these broader political issues that are affecting the daily lives of so many. And I bring that up because in part of the Republican candidates' attacks on Warnock, and more broadly, not just this race, you'll see this in politics in general now, is the label socialist. Right. And say, oh, they want to turn the United States into a socialist country. It's going to be just like all of these other failed socialist states, and you can't trust them. And implicit in that is a racial evaluation and a theological evaluation that says my theology is superior to their theology that says to get involved politically in this way, and my theology says get involved politically in that way, and mine is better. And that's always had a racial component to it. And it's just interesting that in terms of what we're seeing in the current political landscape, that's also become very clear.
Yeah. I've definitely noticed that as well. And so I want to move from here, but I think they're connected to the idea in the middle of your book about relationships. And as you know, you write about, and many people are aware, there are not very many white people who have deep and real and lasting relationships with people outside of their white community. And one of the things that happens from that, right, is that we get siloed into these political and theological and social distinctions and not to say that have a friend who's different than you and that'll change your views on everything, but that is a part of it, right? Is that when I can think of friends who live in Richmond, Virginia, my friend who is white and who lives in the suburbs and was in a Bible study with a group of women who lived in a housing project in Richmond who were all Black. And she said, I read our newspaper about a shooting that happens in this neighborhood unbelievably differently than I did a year ago, because that's my friend whose neighbor was caught up in something that is devastating. And that's so different than when I put up my suburban white distanced frame on it. So all that is to say, relationships can really inform the way we change our theological and social imaginations. One of the places in the book you say, however, don't just go out and start looking for Black friends in a fake way, right? Like, again, not time to check a list. And you write, the watchword for interracial friendships is humility, not utility. So I thought that was a good pairing. And I wonder if you can talk about what does it look like to be humble, while at the same time intentionally pursuing friendships with people who are outside of your most, again, in America, kind of naturally occurring social group.
Yeah, I think we have to constantly measure our motives when we are reaching across racial and ethnic lines to develop relationships and friendships. There are people who I call collectors, and these are white folks who collect relationships with Black people and people of color as a way to sort of give them cover and say, I'm not racist, because look at all of these, relationships I've cultivated with people who are different. And on its surface, it looks good, but it's fundamentally self-centered because it's not about the other person. It's about you. It's about how you look at how you feel about yourself and how you think other people in the world will perceive you. So that's a utility mindset, that you're not valuing other people simply for who they are as image bearers of God, but purely for what they can do for you in terms of giving you these quote unquote diverse friendships, right? And the humility part comes in, one good question to ask is, would I be friends with this person even if we never talked about race? And basically saying, would we be in an authentic, deep relationship even if they didn't give me anything, more information or equipping about this issue of race, but I can be in relationship with them simply for who they are, how God has crafted and shaped them to be. And in a relationship like that, race is going to come up. Your differences are going to come up. Your different backgrounds and experiences are going to come up. But that's not the only thing, or perhaps not even the primary thing that bonds you together. So as people develop relationships across racial, ethnic, cultural lines, being very careful to honor people as people and not simply as my Asian friend or my Black friend or my Latino friend, whatever it might be.
Thank you for that. Yeah, I do think that that sense of how do I intentionally challenge myself, especially as a white person, to move outside of my neighborhood / church / school if I am only really in those relationships with white people, and yet on the same token not to do that in a way that is utilizing other people. I think that's a challenge, but it's not at all an impossible one, and it comes down to like a posture of the heart and recognizing both that I have things I need to learn and receive from anyone I encounter, but also that I have things to give, and that's what a friendship would be, right? Is that I'm encountering someone not just for my own use, but also so that we can enter into a relationship of care towards each other, whether that's about, oh, we both have sons and we're trying to figure out what it means to raise them in this culture, or we both have a shared interest in bird watching or whatever. I want to also make sure that we talk a little bit about the commitment aspect of your book. And I think that maybe the thorniest place to land, so I want to go there, is talking about wealth. You bring up the topic of reparations at the end of your book. I wrote a big post for Christianity Today after Ta-Nehisi Coates' reparations article came out. So whatever that was, a decade ago. And I'm aware, in terms of the response to that post and conversations since then, of just it's a topic that gets people going. But it's interesting. I've quoted to my husband multiple times the same thing from your book since I read it this week, which is a quotation from Malcolm X and then your own words. So I'm just going to read it. This is towards the end. You write, "It is good that laws have been passed to ban racial segregation, permit interracial marriage, and establish holidays commemorating civil rights leaders. But this is not reparations. As Malcolm X put it, if you stick a knife in my back 9 inches and pull it out 6 inches, there's no progress. If you pull it all the way out, that's not progress. Progress is healing the wound that the blow made." And that's the end of his quote. Then you write, "The racial wealth gap is the bleeding wound of racism that will not heal apart from a comprehensive and substantive policy of financial reparations for Black people in America." I really appreciated the boldness of your words there, and even the image. That's what was so striking to me, was using that image of a knife in the back and it being pulled out. What my husband and I talked about, we've talked before about how as white people, we've run through our lives with the wind at our back. And for anyone who's a runner knows that you don't notice that the wind is at your back because you're working hard when you're running, no matter what. And then if you turn around, you're like, oh my gosh, I was not working nearly as hard as I have to in order to run the other direction. And that often we talk about how other people have been born into situations where they are running with the wind in their face. And I was like, yeah, now we're talking about people running with the wind in their face and a knife in their back. That's, obviously even harder. But I'm thinking a lot about what does it mean to actually address the wound, right? Not even, as you said, just to pull the knife out, but to be a participant in repair and in healing. And I'm thinking specifically about wealth. There's a policy level to that. Is there an individual level to that, or an institutional level that may or may not involve laws changing? Can you speak to that? Because I think it's important, and it's, I think, uncomfortable for white people especially, but I think it's really important to at least start the conversation, if not get to some real action.
Right. Well, I appreciate you bringing up that quote and that section, because what I was really trying to get at there was the ideal of reparations as repair. I'm really concerned about people in general, Christians in particular, who in whatever way, shape, or form come to a realization that racism is an urgent issue that we must address. But then the immediate reflex to say, okay, what are we moving forward? How do we look ahead and change? Where there's not the attempt to turn around and look at the trail of traumatized people left in your wake before you got it, before you understood what an issue it was. And one of those things that happens when we look back is that we see how much a part of racism was economic exploitation. Mm-hmm. And that fundamentally is what race-based chattel slavery was, yes, it was this ideological white supremacist view of race that put white people over and above Black people and other people of color, but it was also an economic institution that enriched the plantation owners and the slaveholder class at the expense of Black laborers who were not compensated. And one of the things I hasten to explain is that this is not just about race-based chattel slavery. If you think about it, it's about what happened and is still happening now. And so in the Jim Crow era, which was, in The Color of Compromise, I say racism never goes away, it adapts. And so after the abolition of slavery, the adaptation of racism was Jim Crow, segregation, and inequality, where Black people couldn't go to the same schools, which means they weren't getting equipped for the same jobs, which meant they couldn't make as much money. Black people and other people of color were redlined into certain residential communities, which were typically low income and high poverty, which meant they didn't have the tax base for better schools, et cetera, et cetera. It also meant things like even if Black people got the job, they wouldn't get the promotion that would put them over white people in a position of authority. There were many unions which were organizing for better wages and better working conditions Black people were excluded from. There were benefits like the GI Bill that Black people were excluded from. And so when you talk about the economic exploitation of it all, it goes far beyond even slavery and all that went with that. So
well, and
what do
also
you
far
do?
beyond, like, just to interject, also far beyond the South.
Yep.
Because I think as someone who
Yes.
lives in the North, it is also really easy for people to say, ugh, and just be dismissive of what happened in the South, as opposed to recognizing that, like, Northern insurance companies were the ones insuring the quote unquote property of the slave owners. And throughout these years of redlining, much of that happened throughout northern cities. And if I look at Connecticut, our schools are functionally segregated, and that has a long history that goes back to what you're saying, and it has significant economic repercussions on, to this day, white children and Black and brown children in our state. So I just want to interject that we're not only talking about, a handful of states in one part of the country, but we're talking about the whole.
Oh, yes, that's right. That's right. I'm glad you brought that up. It's everywhere. One of the things I often say is that bigotry doesn't have boundaries, and racism doesn't stop at the Mason-Dixon line. So this is a national issue. And so, yes, we have to make. I just don't think you're having a serious conversation about racial justice unless at some point you're talking about money. And as you mentioned, what does that look like? Because there's a federal aspect to it, because the federal government permitted slavery for so long, and so many laws and policies are creating and perpetuating wealth inequality. But at the same time, Duke Kwon and Greg Thompson are writing a book about reparations, and they talk about the concept of ecclesiastical reparations, the idea that Christians can take initiative on their own and not wait for a political entity to pass a law or have a committee. And with some of the things I mentioned in the book that, just get at the financial aspect of it are, something as simple as paying off the mortgage of a Black church that's having to expend a considerable part of their budget just to keep the building. Bivocational Black pastors and pastors of color, what does it look like to fully fund them so that they can do this full time and not be stretched in different directions? There colleges and universities. So you ask, what is the role? And honestly, most of the time we're lagging behind. We're learning from other sectors. And so colleges and universities, from Princeton Seminary to Georgetown University, other places, go examining their institutional history. These are really old institutions, so they actually had involvement in race-based chattel slavery and whatnot. And they're trying to make amends and repair. And so at Georgetown, you can get, if you were a descendant of some of the enslaved people who they sold to keep the university going, you can actually now attend for free. And that's a form of, making reparations or amends or repair for that exploitation that was done before. And I just think we can get super creative about this, even as the church, and not have to wait on a political body to make decisions for us. Right is right and wrong is wrong, and we can act on it.
Yeah, and I think especially for people of faith who are, like, called by our God to be generous with our wealth, to see it as not belonging to us, but as something we've been entrusted with for the good of our communities. For me, one of the challenges, just on a very personal level, has been to recognize, I give, in terms of the money that we give away, have been historically giving to white churches, white-run nonprofits, and lots of essentially white people. Not always to only benefit white people, but recognizing that I have not been investing in Black churches, in Black communities and in businesses, in schools, all of these different things. And that's on a certainly a smaller level than a Princeton or a Georgetown or the federal government. Nevertheless, it has changed my consciousness to start thinking, okay, how can I be supporting through my tithe or my giving causes, churches, organizations where they are really led by and serving people of color, both Black and brown. So just to offer another handful of ways that people can be looking at their whole lives and saying, what does it mean to participate in an act of healing that will ultimately be healing, hopefully, for the people who've been in a position of oppression, but also for those of us. I mean, it hurts us when we are part of the harm, right? So it's a healing work for all of us.
And I just want to say, to your point about our personal giving, many people have heard it said, budgets are moral documents. And the way we spend our money, the Bible says where your treasure is, there your heart is also. And the way we spend our money indicates something of the priorities that we give to different things. And so let 2021 be the year where we intentionally seek out Black-led and people of color-led ministries and organizations that we contribute to financially. And I think that's a really important step to take. And I will also say this, that there's not a one-to-one ratio between one's own labor and effort in giving and the impact of that giving. And I say that because it seems like such a little thing to write a check or to go online and to fill out a form to donate money. And especially if you're wealthy and you can afford to do that, it seems like, well, I have to do more. Yeah, I do. That would be great. I want you to do more, but I also don't want to undercut the value of financial contributions and financial support, partly because of what we've been talking about, reparations and the racial wealth gap and all of that. That Black people and people of color, we don't have the same access to that kind of capital that we need to make our dreams and our visions for godly impact and for justice a reality. So that small gesture on your part could have a massive impact on from the perspective of the actual organization you're supporting.
Yeah, I agree, and I think that it's really important not to minimize the importance of wealth and of the economic aspect of all of this. Well, we're coming to a close in our time, so I just want to ask you one last question. Your book ends on a note of hope, and I don't think it would have made much sense to write it if you didn't have hope. So I just wanted to end by asking that. What gives you reason for hope? Where does it come from? What are you seeing? Where does your hope come from?
From several places, obviously from Scripture, where throughout the Bible, it's never the case that as you're pursuing justice, things get easier or you see results immediately. Sometimes you labor for a lifetime, and the fruit of your work is seen in the next generation.
Yeah.
Which on one hand can be discouraging, but on the other, it means that none of our work is wasted. The Bible also prepares us for what comes in this work. It just stands out to me profoundly that essentially the climax in Matthew 5 of the Sermon on the Mount is that Jesus says, you will be persecuted. Right. It's just like all of this beautiful prose about, the meek shall inherit the earth and blessed are the poor and all of this stuff, and you will be persecuted.
Well, and you'll be persecuted for righteousness, which could also be translated justice, right? Like you'll be persecuted for justice. Exactly.
Jesus is guaranteeing that. Like it's not an if, maybe if you do it wrong or if you're in the wrong place at the wrong time, you're going to be persecuted for justice. He said, no, if you're going to pursue this stuff, you're going to be persecuted. And so that gives me hope in the sense that it means when stuff gets hard, it doesn't necessarily mean I'm doing it wrong.
Okay. Yeah.
It could mean the opposite. It could mean I'm doing exactly the right thing. The other thing that gives me encouragement is looking to the ancestors. And so as a student of history, I gain so much motivation and encouragement from looking to others, particularly Black Christians, who have done this work. The Fannie Lou Hamers of the world, the Ida B. Wells of the world, Martin Luther King, of course, and looking at their example under honestly much harsher conditions. that I'm facing now in the 21st century as a Black person, and seeing how their faith really motivated them and helped them through. And then lastly, what gives me hope is that, we're having conversations like this.
Yeah.
That as much as I desire for many, many, many more people to get on and stay on this journey of racial justice, there are people on that journey, and there are more people coming. And it's never going to be really the majority, one would say, but it's that small group of committed people who have truly been changed, who have truly been catalyzed to want to make a difference, who are scrappy and resourceful and creative, and who make a difference. And we see signs of that. Maybe not in national laws changed yet, maybe not in the total eradication of a particular injustice, but we do see change, we do see progress. And the last thing I'll say is, it's not just about the world changing outside of us, it's about changing us too. Right. That as we pursue justice, as we endure persecution for righteousness' sake, it changes who we are and refines our character to be more like Jesus. So that's an important aspect of this journey as well.
Well, thank you for that. Thank you for writing both your books. Thank you for talking today. And thank you for the encouragement that it gives me to get to engage with all of these ideas.
Absolutely. I always love talking to you. You ask such great questions, and it's a privilege to share and be on with you.
Well, we will look forward to next time, which I'm guessing it might be a couple years before your next book comes out. So maybe we'll have you on in between just to check in.
Anytime. Thanks again.
Well, thank you, Jemar, and I hope that the book launch goes really well. I'm going to say the name of your book one more time: How to Fight Racism, Courageous Christianity, and the Journey Towards Racial Justice by Jemar Tisby. Highly recommend it to anyone who's listening. Thanks so much for listening to Love is Stronger Than Fear. As always, we will note everything that was said here in the show notes. And I would love for you, especially at the start of a new season, to share this episode with people who you think might be interested, not just in this conversation, but in a series of conversations about hope and healing and the ways in which we can, in our very everyday lives, respond with our heads, our hearts, and our hands to the brokenness and social division all around us. If you are new here, I invite you to subscribe to this podcast. You'll get a new episode every Tuesday morning. And of course, it's always helpful if you'll give a quick rating or review, if you will share this on social media, respond to me directly, and just let me know if there are guests that you think I should consider for future episodes, or if you just want to give me some feedback on how the podcast is going. I also always want to thank Jake Hansen for editing this podcast, and Amber Beery, my social media coordinator, who puts everything else together behind the scenes. Thank you to both of them. And for all of you listening, as you go into your day today, I hope that you will carry with you the peace that comes from believing that love is stronger than fear.